Okay, Mr. Rushford, you ready to get started?
Sure.
Okay, great. So I want to thank everybody and welcome Mr. Rushford again for the third in his three-part series on international trade. Mr. Rushford is the editor and publisher of the Rushford Report, and we're very delighted to have you here and anxious to hear the third part of your lecture series. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you too, and welcome everybody. This one's on the big picture, the World Trade Organization. The WTO is the international institution that has presided over the rules of global trade flows for the past 25 years. It's been part of the world's most successful international economic experiment, but is presently facing an uncertain future as support for its mission in key world capitals has waned. So this is important. There's only barely enough time this morning to explain briefly some of the issues, much less answer all of the questions. The idea is to offer an analytic framework and suggest some sources for further reading and reflection aimed at equipping you to think through some big thoughts independently. So let's take this from the top. More than 600, and don't worry if your notes aren't entirely accurate, because I'm going to give you a lot of sources today for further reading. I'll post this class on my website, so if you're interested, there'll be plenty of opportunities to follow up. Now, from the beginning, more than 600 international civil servants who come from more than 80 countries work in the WTO Secretariat. It's headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. The historic Centre William Rapard is a gem of European classical architecture. It dates back to the 1920s. It's situated in a lovely park. It has inspiring sculptures, and it runs along the shore of Lake Geneva. Distant views of the famous Mont Blanc and the Swiss Alps. But regardless of the impressive surroundings, keep this in mind. The responsibility for the decision-making is not vested in the staffers and director general who work in Geneva, as important as their renowned expertise is. The responsibility for setting the rules of global commerce is to be found at the highest political levels of government in 164 member countries. To repeat, because this isn't always understood as well as it should be, the key to understanding the political economy that drives the WTO is to be found in the political calculations in various world capital cities. To give you an idea of how this works, I'll be highlighting briefly the central thinking these days in three of those capitals which are attracting the most attention. New Delhi, Beijing, and Washington, D.C. Now, the driving economic idea when the WTO was launched in 1995 was to build upon the successes of its predecessor organization, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The GATT had been established in 1947. It was tasked with slashing high protectionist tariffs that had been notorious drags on global economic growth during some particularly nasty trade wars of the 1930s. But before we get to the economics of dealing with tariff wars, the first thing to keep in mind is the fundamental rationale that has always driven the GATT and the WTO. It's national security. I want to take a few minutes to explain this because you might not get it in an economics classroom except sort of in passing, but it's really important. I would highly recommend that you Google a 2018 report entitled "The International Trading System at Risk and the Need to Return to First Principles." The report was written for the Economics and Security Committee of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. This is as good an explanation of the importance of the GATT and the WTO historically and presently as I've seen. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly is based in Brussels. It brings together parliamentarians, meaning members of the US Congress and their legislative counterparts in the 30 NATO countries. The acronym NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This North American European military alliance was created in 1949 as a defensive shield against military aggression from Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. It's the world's oldest military alliance, and today the NATO forces remain on the watch for mischief from Russia's president, Vladimir Putin. American leadership in NATO has always been regarded as central. Now, to be clear, NATO and its parliamentary assembly are totally separate institutions from the GATT and the WTO. People who work in these organizations don't even talk to each other. I'm not even sure how much the NATO parliamentarians talk to their counterparts on the military side of NATO. Still, I think it's very important to recognize that prominent NATO circles have always believed in the economic portfolio of the GATT and the WTO. They understand that this is about way more than economics. Am I still online? It just disappeared here.
No, you still look good.
Okay, I can't see, I can see my emails for some reason, but never mind.
Okay.
Here, I want to read you a paragraph of this 2018 report, which looked back over the years at what the GATT and the WTO had accomplished. Here it is. The liberal trading system established after World War II had not only contributed to an unprecedented rise of prosperity on both sides of the Atlantic, pulled millions out of poverty, and encouraged the diffusion of technology and ideas, it also had reinforced the security order. In fact, security, democracy, and free trade proved mutually reinforcing. Continuing, the report recognized that world leaders who had created the liberal international economic order after World War II, I quote, they knew full well that during the 1930s, an array of so-called beggar thy neighbor protectionist measures had contributed to the Great Depression, poisoned interstate relations, and had doubtless been a central factor in the descent into World War II. In other words, as former U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who served under President Franklin D. Roosevelt from 1933 to 1944, as he said, trade wars tend to end in real shooting wars. Trade wars tend to end in real shooting wars. That's why this is important. People fight over money. Here's how Hull put it in his memoirs. I saw that you could not separate the idea of commerce from the idea of war and peace. I therefore came to believe that if we could increase commercial exchanges among nations over lowered trade and tariff barriers and remove international obstacles to trade, we would go a long way toward eliminating war itself. So this nexus between national security, peaceful resolution of conflicts, and economic prosperity is so fundamental that today it's often overlooked or just taken for granted. Now let's get to why the GATT and the WTO were regarded as the world's most successful international economic experiment. The details are on the WTO's website. But basically, when the GATT was launched, the 1930s, 40s era of global tariffs had been in the 40% range. That's a 40% tax on what you buy. Thanks to a series of GATT multilateral, that means negotiations between all the nations, thanks to a series of these multilateral negotiating rounds over the years, those tariffs have been slashed to an average of about 5% when the WTO took over the GATT's legal framework in 1995. Presently, they're about half that. So the lives of countless millions of people around the world who have never heard of the GATT or the WTO have been enriched. Trade barriers to economic growth have steadily, if too slowly, been dismantled. Now, these days, the WTO deals with far more than tariffs. You can browse the WTO's website if you're interested. There are issues associated with smoothing the flow of information technology across international borders, with helping the poorer member countries expand their international trade opportunities, and difficult political issues associated with making international agricultural trade more efficient. You can see these by poking around the WTO site. You also might familiarize yourself with the sites for the World Bank here in Washington, D.C., and the OECD. The OECD is based in Paris, is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The members are the so-called rich countries. These sites house some of the world's best international economic research. You will never run out of term paper materials when you go there. There's also a core principle that drives the WTO that is well worth keeping in mind. It's called MFN, Most Favored Nation. It's simple but not simplistic. The MFN treatment means that WTO member countries must not discriminate against other trading partners. All must be treated equally. The United States, once again, was first among equals in insisting that the GATT and the WTO would be based on the core MFN obligations. That's not surprising, as the concept of treating all of America's trading partners equally goes to the heart of who we are as a people. I strongly recommend a book called Clashing Over Commerce, A History of U.S. Trade Policy. Now, this tome runs over 800 pages of economic history. Fortunately, it's smooth reading and could be absorbed in bites. This remarkable book was written by Douglas Irwin, who's the nation's leading economic historian. He teaches economics at Dartmouth College. I often consult it for the perspectives it sheds on otherwise confusing current headlines. Now, Irwin notes that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1785, "I think all the world would gain by setting commerce at perfect liberty." And this on trade from Benjamin Franklin. Most of the restraints put upon it in different countries seem to have been the projects of particulars for their private interest under the pretense of public good. Remember last week we talked about the rose growers and the steel lobby and so forth. Projects of particulars for private interest under the pretense of public good. There's a lot to think about there. So the question then is, why, considering this impressive history, is the WTO today an institution in serious trouble? Since its creation in 1995, the WTO hasn't been able to conclude one major multilateral trade liberalizing round of negotiations. The so-called Doha round, which began in 2001, has been in a coma for more than a decade. Paul Bluestein, a former Washington Post top reporter, wrote about the Doha collapse in his 2009 groundbreaking book titled Misadventures of the Most Favored Nations. This will be required reading sooner or later when you get into college. You could start it now. We don't have time to highlight every one of these issues, but to give a flavor about why the political will in key world capitals has been declining over the last few years, I immodestly suggest that you might want to go to my own website. It's rushfordreport.com, and check out a few articles that document the decline over the last few years. I wrote Murder on the Doha Express for the Milken Institute Review in 2012. 2 years later, I contributed the General Disagreement on Tariffs and Trade to Foreign Policy magazine. And in 2015, I contributed the WTO Struggles in Nairobi for the Wall Street Journal. And 3 years later, I wrote again for the journal, Trump's War on the WTO. Let's get to India, China, and the US and the politics that are going on today, just very quickly. India only holds about 2% of global trade flows. But in the WTO negotiations, India has always been difficult, and other countries follow the Indian example. Indian politicians really have never seemed to believe in multilateral trade liberalization. They will say that India can cut its own high tariffs when leaders believe that that's in their own self-interest. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen frequently. Indian leaders have always championed Buy India laws aimed at keeping globally competitive foreigners at bay. It's terrible economics, as India has remained impoverished. But the domestic lobbies in India that benefit from the schemes have never complained. India has just this year played a leading role in once again delaying the most important current negotiations that the WTO has going now. Uh, these negotiations are aimed at prohibiting harmful government subsidies that have contributed to overfishing and the depletion of fish stocks worldwide. If you're interested in those details, just stay tuned. I intend to publish a detailed report in my online journal in the very near future. Now, everyone's naturally curious about China's role. I'm one of those who welcomed China's secession to the World Trade Organization. I've been pleased to watch China's economy grow and hundreds of millions of its people benefit over the last few years as China opened its markets to the world. China has also been one of the obstacles to a successful WTO deal to save the world's fishing grounds. Uh, China's the world's biggest subsidizer. They have these huge industrial scale fishing fleets that are doing much of the harm in waters as far away as West Africa. China is also the world's second largest economy now, which is a good thing. Yet in the WTO fish negotiations, China is insisting that it be given special carve-outs, doing as little as possible to stop lavishing support on its fishing industry as if it were one of the world's poorer countries. Since joining the WTO, leaders of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing have often spoken highly of the institution. They have praised multilateralism in general. But if I had to write an article today making the case that China is leading the WTO today, it would be short. Beijing has been negotiating to join the WTO's government procurement agreement, under which member countries agree to open public contracts to competitive international bidders. They've been negotiating this since 2002 without success. Remember how trade politics in New Delhi turn on Buy Indian trade rules? Well, Beijing has its Buy Chinese rules, and many ways to make life uncomfortable for foreign investors. In 2008, China, along with India, helped put the WTO's so-called Doha round of trade liberalization in its present coma. Again, Paul Bluestein's Misadventures of the Most Favored Nations has the details as to some of my writings that I'd mentioned. This month, Australia called for a global medical inquiry conducted under the auspices of the World Health Organization to get to the bottom of how the present coronavirus pandemic began. China's response to ban certain imports of Australian beef. As the Wall Street Journal editorialized last week, this just constitutes flat out coercive economic diplomacy. It's not helpful. As for the United States, political support for multilateral trade liberalization has been declining in recent years. It started way before President Obama. He served for 2 4-year terms, but Obama never gave the WTO much of a priority. Instead, he focused on a smaller regional trade deal with just 11 trading partners called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But Obama failed to obtain the necessary approval for even that deal from the US Congress. And then in one of his first acts in office in 2017, President Trump withdrew the United States from the TPP. Now, President Donald Trump's stated positions on the WTO are very clear. In his own words, he has repeatedly called the WTO, quote, a disaster. He has said that he is a tariff man. He has launched a series of trade wars against American trading partners ranging from Canada and the Europeans to China, among others. He said that he believes that trade wars are, quote, easy to win. He is for America first, along the same lines that Narendra Modi in India is for India first. Multilateralism is no longer on the American trade agenda. Presently, the White House has been busy raising tariffs on imports that present so-called national security threats. You remember the importance of national security. The national security threats that the Trump White House is talking about, I'm not making this up. They're automobile bumpers and nails. Talk about material for term papers. The United States has also brought the WTO's legal machinery to resolve trade disputes between members to a halt. This was accomplished simply by withholding consensus to replace the expiring terms of juris on the appellate body. That's the WTO's judicial body that resolves trade disputes among nations equally or fairly. It now cannot function because it lacks a quorum. And the United States trade officials no longer say that Washington still believes in the WTO's core principle, most favored nation, non-discriminatory treatment of all trading partners. I've asked repeatedly. Now, to date, President Trump's top trade negotiator, Robert Lighthizer, hasn't even visited WTO headquarters in Geneva. Now, for your own research, I recommend, besides President Trump's own tweets, 2 recent columns in the New York Times. One is authored by White House trade official Peter Navarro, the other by U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer. Senator Josh Hawley, a Republican from Missouri, has also written an opinion piece in the New York Times that calls for the U.S. to withdraw from the WTO. These are essential reading, and in connection, I would recommend an analysis by William Reinsch. It's Reinsch. He's a veteran trade authority who's affiliated with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. You can find him on the web. Now, one final thought. I've just given you a lot to worry about. The aim isn't to discourage you at all, but to encourage you. Your generation can tackle these concerns. My generation had even worse problems to face. When I was born in 1944, people were still getting killed in Europe in World War II. In 1945, after the war ended, Europe was devastated. There were millions upon millions of refugees struggling to rebuild their lives. Across the Pacific, Japan was flattened. People were starving in the Philippines. The wasn't even in the picture then. When I first visited Europe in the 1960s, almost 20 years after the fighting ended, piles of rubble were still visible in bombed out cities like, pardon me, Rotterdam and London. Today, these cities have been restored. Pardon me. They're gems. So before I lose my voice, don't give up. Pardon me. Your generation has, you should be happy facing these challenges. Pardon me for coughing. You want to take a pause here? Pardon me, that was terrible.
Okay.
Fine, thank you.
You're welcome.
Can you see me now?
Yeah, I can see you just fine.
Okay, good. Am I on mute?
You are back on. You're good to go.
Okay, have I been on, or did my coughing fit everything?
Yeah, it must have knocked you off, but that's okay. We're right back on. You're good. You're good to go. Do you need another moment?
I think I'm okay. Did I finish class, and did I get to the part where I had listed all these troubles the WTO is facing, and then talked about how previous generations had even more difficult tasks? So I would just say to all the students, you have a lot of good work to do. This is a good time to be young and well educated, and don't be discouraged. Be challenged and inspired.
Great. That's great. So, all right, very good. Thank you so much, Mr. Rushford. I'm glad you're back with us and ready to answer any questions that our students or guests might have. Does anybody have a question for Mr. Rushford this morning?
Got to be one with all this material.
Oh, so much material.
I have a quick question.
Great.
Yes.
Go ahead, Trish.
With the mention of the WTO not being able to be as effective and productive in modern times, a lot of what we kind of hear in the, bringing industries back to America ties to jobs, creating more jobs. Without the WTO, what do you think the impact would be on American jobs? Will that actually help, or will it actually hurt?
You can't do it. You could go back to the 1930s and put up trade barriers, but your workers would be uncompetitive globally, or the tariff wars of the recent years have already slowed global trade down. What I would suggest is go to the website of the OECD and the World Bank and the WTO, and they document the effect of the global trade growth, which has already started to slow down. It doesn't work in the long run. If it did, India would already be rich.
Great. Any other questions, kids? You got any questions for Mr. Rushford?
The last one was a
They're
good
quiet as
question.
church mice this morning.
Well, there's a lot here.
A lot. It's all great information, though. It's all really great information. All right. Well, then I will say a hearty Wakefield Country Day School thank you to you, Mr. Rushford. It's been really an exemplary class. It's a lot of information in 3 classes, but we're very, very grateful to you. And I think for these young people who are going off to college in the fall, it's going to give them a really pretty solid foundation as to whether or not they're interested in exploring economics and international trade any further as they go out into their the next part of their academic career. As for the rest of this morning, coming up at 10:45, we have Mr. Chuck Ockrey. He is the CEO and CIO of Ockrey Capital Management. He's got over $14 billion under management. He will be talking about what to do with all that extra money. And then the next week, we've got Sarah Mattingly, who is an award-winning independent digital photographer and a graduate of Wakefield Country Day School, 1983. She'll be giving a class on photography. And Abby Larner, who is the niece of the chairman of the board, Paul Larner, will give us a lesson on marketing your small business, social media marketing basics. So that's coming up next week, but in just half an hour or so, Mr. Ockrey will be back on, and you all should all have that link. So again, Mr. Rushford, thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge with our students. Really great.
I have a chat here. What do I do?
Oh. Somebody sent you a chat? So you can read it out loud unless it's personal, maybe.
Well, I don't know. Someone who said that I'd sparked a lot of conversation. Agree or disagree, that's the point of this. And if you want to go out and write term papers supporting America First policies,
great.
You can read those articles mentioned, and you'll get a head start. And more power to you. Just argue it well.
Yes, that's great. That's great. Well, very good. So I thank everybody for being here this morning, and we'll see hopefully all of you in about 25 minutes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Somebody was saying something.
Mr. Larner has asked if you will send him your suggested editorials.
I wanted just to tell them who wrote them and what the publication, let them hunt around and find them on themselves rather than just give links. If that's okay. I can put them online when I publish this.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. That sounds a good way to go.
Okay. Super.
Yeah, you just Google Peter Navarro, New York Times, or Robert Lighthizer, New York Times. They'll come up. They're in the last week or so.
Ah, great. All righty, we're going to say bye-bye now.
Bye, thank you.
See you all in half an hour, or not even.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you for all your suggestions on reading.
Thanks,
You
Trish.
bet.